Welcome to our channel, where history comes alive with untold stories and hidden truths. In today's video, we explore the secret world of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife. Join us as we uncover her inner struggles, passions, and the deeper legacy that history often forgets. The hidden life of Catherine Howard. Beyond the court, secrets, power, and tragedy unveiled. Part 1. A Shadowed Beginning, Catherine's Early Years. Catherine Howard's life began in obscurity, far removed from the dazzling courts of Tudor England she would one day inhabit. Born around 1523, likely at Lambeth Palace, she was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard and Joyce Culpeper. Her father, though of noble lineage, struggled financially and professionally, casting Catherine's early years into a haze of instability. Unlike her cousin in Boleyn, who received a polished education on the continent, Catherine's upbringing was less structured, less formalized, and deeply influenced by the fractured world of the minor aristocracy. After the death of her mother, Catherine was sent to live under the guardianship of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess presided over a large and rather loosely supervised household at Lambeth, where dozens of young lords and ladies-in-waiting mingled freely. It was here that Catherine's formative years took shape, years often marked by both freedom and neglect. The Duchess's household lacked the rigid discipline of a royal nursery, and Catherine's education was superficial at best. She learned music and dancing, developed grace and charm, but lacked the deeper scholastic and religious instruction expected of high-born girls. In this liberal environment, Catherine formed early attachments that would shape the course of her future. Most notably, she entered into a flirtation, some argue a consummated relationship, with her music teacher, Henry Manox. This was followed by a more serious and perhaps cohabiting relationship with Frances Dereham, a secretary in the household. These youthful entanglements were far from unusual in such settings, where supervision was light and temptation plentiful. But for a girl of noble birth, these relationships carried heavy consequences, especially when one would become queen. Despite her noble lineage, Catherine was far from a prominent figure in her early years. She did not have the wealth, influence, or court connections to ensure a strong marriage or a defined path to power. Her father's frequent absences and indebtedness likely compounded this sense of displacement. She was in many ways caught between two worlds, noble in blood, yet common in opportunity. This liminality would haunt her, as she was later thrust into a spotlight for which she was neither prepared nor protected. Yet even in these early years, glimpses of Catherine's inner character can be found. Accounts suggest she was vivacious, charming, and eager for affection. She craved attention, and perhaps lacked the steady, guiding hand that might have helped her navigate the treacherous waters of noble expectations. What some would later interpret as recklessness may have stemmed from a deep emotional need for validation and connection, needs shaped by her fragmented childhood. She was not merely foolish, she was vulnerable, and that vulnerability would become increasingly exposed in the years to come. Catherine's early life was not defined by grandeur, but by a struggle for identity and belonging. She was one of many noble girls trying to find their place in a rapidly changing England, where birth offered prestige, but not always security. Before she was a queen, she was a ward, a daughter, and a young woman navigating emotional complexity with limited tools. Her beginnings were neither glamorous nor enviable, but they were crucial. To understand the woman she would become, one must first understand the girl she once was. Part 2. From Lambeth to Court, Catherine's entry into royal service. The journey from the crowded halls of Lambeth to the polished splendor of Henry VIII's court was not a straight line for Catherine Howard. It was shaped by fortune, family influence, and a court ever hungry for beauty, youth, and distraction. By the late 1530s, Catherine's prospects, though still uncertain, began to change as her powerful Howard relatives positioned her closer to the royal inner circle. Her uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, remained a central figure in Tudor politics, always eager to assert the Howard name and influence. It was likely through his maneuvering that Catherine was introduced to court life, where ambition and appearance could eclipse background. Catherine entered the household of Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, sometime in late 1539 or early 1540. She served as one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, a role that provided proximity to the king and a place within the complex tapestry of court intrigue. Though Anne of Cleves herself was a foreign princess with limited cultural connection to Henry, Catherine's presence soon stood in stark contrast. Young, English, graceful, and unencumbered by diplomacy, contemporary sources paint a picture of a radiant teenager whose charm and flirtation did not go unnoticed by the aging and frustrated monarch. Henry was already disillusioned with Anne, whom he famously declared he could not warm to, making Catherine's light all the more appealing to him. Her rise within court circles was swift and dramatic. To those observing from afar, she seemed to come out of nowhere, a sudden bloom in the king's winter garden. But this ascent was carefully watched by the Howard faction, who understood the power a queen could wield if properly coached and guided. For Catherine, however, the transition was likely overwhelming. She had little formal education, no experience in diplomacy, and scant preparation for the political responsibilities that came with being a consort, even unofficially. Behind the scenes, her past, quietly buried at Lambeth, remained an open secret to those who had known her before. Henry Manox and Frances Derham, once mere footnotes in her adolescence, would later become central to the story of her downfall. But at this stage, these prior attachments had not yet surfaced at court, and Catherine had no reason to believe they ever would. As far as she knew, she was stepping into a new life, a royal life, where the shadows of her past could not reach her. That assumption would prove dangerously naive. The contrast between Catherine and Anne of Cleves became the subject of court gossip. Where Anne was solemn and awkward in English customs, Catherine was quick to laugh and easy with affection. Where Anne failed to entice the king, Catherine dazzled him. Their youth gap, Henry was nearly 50, Catherine not yet 18, seemed less important in a court obsessed with appearances and renewal. Henry, perhaps longing to reclaim his virility and glory, saw in Catherine a vision of restored youth. She became less a person and more a symbol, a dangerous transformation for any woman in Tudor England. Catherine herself may have been flattered, or she may have been pressured, likely both. Historical accounts suggest that the prospect of royal favor was not entirely her own design, but influenced by family ambition and courtly scheming. Was she in love with Henry? Unlikely. Was she aware of the risks? Possibly, but probably not fully. What is clear is that her move from lady-in-waiting to queen-in-waiting was as sudden as it was fateful. Her entry into court life marked not just a personal turning point, but the beginning of a chain of events that would elevate her to unimaginable heights, before plunging her into tragedy. Catherine Howard had entered a world of masked secrets and power games, and she was playing without a script. What she had gained in status, she had lost in safety. The court was no longer just a place of glittering opportunity, it was a stage set for peril. Part 3. The King's Desire, Catherine and Henry's Courtship. By the summer of 1540, Catherine Howard had become the object of the king's increasingly fervent attention. Henry VIII, now well into middle age and suffering from a swollen leg and chronic pain, was in search of comfort, companionship, and perhaps even redemption. Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, had failed to ignite any passion in him, and their marriage was annulled in July. Within days, Catherine Howard stepped into the king's gaze, not just as a court beauty, but as a potential bride. The pace at which their courtship escalated stunned even seasoned courtiers. Henry was enchanted. Here was a girl of extraordinary youth, seemingly untouched by the political intrigues that had consumed his previous wives. Her lively manners, musical talents, and gentle deference painted the image of the ideal Tudor queen, at least in the eyes of a king desperate for adoration. To Henry, she embodied innocence, joy, and vitality, all that had slipped away from his own life. He lavished her with gifts, fine jewels, silk gowns, and titles of privilege. One of his most telling acts of devotion was naming her Rose Without a Thorn, a deeply symbolic phrase that revealed the king's yearning for something pure, untainted, and safe. Catherine's own feelings during this courtship remain elusive to history. There is little surviving evidence to suggest she returned the king's affections with genuine love. What seems more likely is a mix of awe, pressure, and calculation. She had little choice in matter and everything to gain. She had been elevated to royal favor in a court where favor meant everything. It is doubtful she could have refused Henry, even if she had wanted to. More importantly, she may have believed, naively or hopefully, that this was her moment of triumph, her opportunity to transcend the limits of her early life. Catherine was formally betrothed to Henry by late July 1540, and they were married in secret on July 28th, the same day Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the Cleves marriage, was executed. The union was celebrated at court, though not with the grandeur of earlier royal weddings. Henry seemed to prefer a quieter joy, one focused on his newfound contentment rather than political spectacle. To those around them, the age difference was impossible to ignore. Catherine was likely around 17, Henry was 49, but appearances ruled the Tudor court, and as long as the king was pleased, so was everyone else. The marriage was soon followed by public festivities, where Catherine appeared beside Henry as queen consort. She wore gowns of white and gold, and her presence was described as luminous, an embodiment of youthful splendor against the aging monarch's heavy frame. She had made it to the highest seat in the land, but with it came enormous expectation. Producing an heir would be her most sacred duty. Winning the affection of the court and the people, especially after the widely approved annulment of and of Cleves, would also be vital. Yet beneath the glittering ceremonies and rich fabrics lay uncertainty. Catherine had married a man nearly 3 times her age, known for his temper, his unpredictability, and a growing sense of physical decline. Henry's moods shifted easily from joy to wrath, and his affections, though sincere in the moment, had proven unstable in past marriages. Catherine had no political training, no strong allies of her own, and no real understanding of the perilous currents at court. She stood on the edge of power, but also at the edge of a precipice she could not yet see. Still, for a brief moment, she was adored. The people welcomed her beauty and charm, court poets praised her elegance, and Henry basked in the illusion of renewal. Catherine Howard was Queen of England, glorified, adorned, and in the eye of the storm to come, the courtship had ended. The marriage had begun, and so had the clock ticking toward her downfall. Part 4. Queen in the Spotlight. Life at Court. Catherine Howard's elevation to queenship placed her at the heart of Tudor England's most perilous stage. Every move she made was watched, measured, and quietly judged by courtiers, ambassadors, and rivals alike. Although she wore the crown, Catherine did not wield the political intelligence of her cousin Anne Boleyn or the strategic foresight of Jane Seymour. Instead, she relied on grace, beauty, and charm to navigate the glittering maze of court life. But court life was not simply a pageant of silks and banquets. It was a crucible of scrutiny and danger. Henry VIII initially basked in the glow of his young queen's presence. He paraded her before the court, delighted in her youth, and seemed for a time reinvigorated by the match. Observers at home and abroad took note of Henry's transformation. He smiled more, walked with purpose, and even attempted dances at feasts. Catherine appeared to bring him peace. And for a man bruised by failed marriages and physical decay, this newfound joy was intoxicating. Catherine, however, was far less secure in her position than the outward festivities suggested. The court was filled with factions, some supportive of the Howard family, others deeply suspicious of their growing influence. Enemies of her powerful uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, kept a careful eye on the Queen, hoping for a misstep that could undermine the entire Howard faction. Meanwhile, supporters of the Seymour family, whose influence had declined after Jane's death, quietly yearned for a chance to reassert themselves. In such a climate, even the slightest rumor could be fatal. To her credit, Catherine initially performed her duties with poise. She attended court ceremonies, entertained foreign ambassadors, and presented herself as a gentle and virtuous queen. She was generous with gifts and tried to secure favors for those in her circle, especially women and servants from her past. But this loyalty to familiar faces would prove to be both an emotional comfort and a catastrophic mistake. She surrounded herself with trusted ladies, including Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother, George, a woman who would become entangled in her fate. Despite her outward composure, Catherine was isolated. She lacked close allies in the Privy Council, had little experience with court politics, and often had to rely on instinct rather than counsel. Unlike earlier queens, she did not possess a network of foreign relatives or influential mentors who could help her navigate the shifting power dynamics. Even her husband, though affectionate, was moody and increasingly distracted by health concerns. The abscess in his leg grew worse, and his reliance on painkillers and controlled access to his chambers meant he was often detached from daily affairs. As Henry's health declined, Catherine's role became more symbolic. She was no longer merely a wife, but a figurehead of youth and fertility, a living hope that an heir might still be possible. Yet Catherine had not conceived, and each passing month without a royal pregnancy invited more whispers. To some at court, this failure to produce an heir cast shadows on her virtue, though no evidence suggested she was unfaithful. Still, the Tudor court did not need evidence. It needed only suspicion to ignite a fire. Catherine's need for affection, formed during her unsupervised upbringing at Lambeth, lingered beneath the surface. She was still very much a teenager, playing the part of a queen in a world that rewarded obedience but punished mistakes with lethal finality. She longed for comfort, for understanding, and perhaps for the freedom she had known before the crown settled on her head. The glittering halls of court, once symbols of triumph, now became narrow corridors of pressure, expectation, and fear. And in quiet moments when no one was watching, she may have wondered if she had ever truly escaped the shadows of her past. Catherine Howard stood in the spotlight, admired, adorned, and utterly alone. The court watched her every gesture, eager for brilliance or blunder. And all the while, time and memory crept toward her, secrets waiting to rise. She was queen, but the crown sat uneasy, and the walls were closing in. Part 5, Echoes of the Past, Dangerous Secrets Resurface. Though Catherine Howard wore the crown with poise, the past she thought buried beneath the stones of Lambeth began to stir. Whispers traveled through the corridors of court, carried not by enemies, but by those who had once shared her most private moments. The names of Henry Manox and Francis Dereham, once dismissed as mere shadows, began to re-emerge with haunting consequence. These were not just figures from Catherine's adolescence. They were living links to a time when she was not a queen, but a girl searching for affection in the vulnerable space of the Dowager Duchess's household. The court was a place of observation, where nothing truly stayed hidden. Among Catherine's household staff were women who had known her before, some brought into royal service at her request. It was these familiar faces who, in moments of gossip or perhaps honest reflection, let details slip. The effect was like a ripple through still water. Soon, questions were being raised in quiet corners of the court. Who was the new queen, truly? What secrets followed her behind the veil of courtly grace? Francis Dereham had been part of Catherine's past in a way that deeply troubled Tudor notions of chastity and honor. He had by many accounts referred to her as his betrothed, calling her wife, even before her royal marriage. Whether they had engaged in a formal pre-contract, a legally binding promise of marriage in Tudor law, remained unclear. But if they had, it posed a lethal risk to her queenship. Any pre-contract would have rendered her marriage to Henry invalid. Worse still, it would have painted her not as an innocent rose, but as a woman who had deceived her king. At some point in late 1541, Dereham made the ill-judged decision to seek employment in her royal household. Perhaps he believed that Catherine's favor could bring him influence, or perhaps he sought to secure his silence. Whatever his motives, his arrival at court was a dangerous move, one that raised eyebrows and invited scrutiny. Other members of her past circle, including Lady Rochford, began to sense the weight of secrets pressing against their roles in the Queen's retinue. No one seemed certain how long the veil of silence could hold. Catherine, perhaps out of fear or misplaced loyalty, allowed Dereham into her household. She likely hoped to keep him close, to control the narrative, to manage what he might say to others. But in doing so, she unknowingly lit the fuse. Others who had known of her youthful affairs began to speak more freely, some out of guilt, others out of fear that silence would condemn them too. The once contained story of Catherine's past was becoming court knowledge, and in Tudor England, court knowledge had the power to destroy. What makes this moment so deeply tragic is Catherine's likely lack of understanding about the legal and political weight of her actions. To her, these were private matters, part of a life that no longer existed. But to the king and his council, they were evidence of deception, betrayal, and potential treason. Even if Catherine had believed her past was irrelevant, the machinery of Tudor justice would not agree. Once her secrets began to surface, they could not be reburied. Meanwhile, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, ever vigilant in his duties to the crown, was informed of the rumors. Cranmer did not act rashly. Instead, he approached the king with a carefully worded letter on All Saints' Day in 1541, slipping it quietly into Henry's hands during a church service. The letter revealed the allegations against Catherine and urged the king to consider them with gravity and discretion. Henry, by all accounts, was devastated. His illusion of purity, of youthful innocence and untainted love, shattered in a single stroke. The queen, once so adored, was now under silent investigation. Her chambers were searched. Her servants questioned. Her freedom began to vanish, piece by piece. The past had found her, and it was no longer content to remain hidden. Part 6, Interrogations and Intrigue, the Web Titans. Once the whispers of Catherine Howard's past reached King Henry's ears, the royal court shifted from celebration to suspicion. The mask of courtly joy fell away. replaced by fear, betrayal, and the calculated silence of those unsure where the axe might fall. Archbishop Cranmer had delivered the news with caution, but the implications were immediate and immense. The king, once blinded by affection, was now seething, his pride wounded, and his trust obliterated. And in the icy corridors of Whitehall, a quiet hunt began. Catherine was placed under guard in her rooms, her freedom gone as swiftly as it had come. She was not told at first of the full scale of the investigation unfolding around her. Courtiers who once bowed deeply in her presence now passed by with eyes lowered or doors closed. Behind the scenes, a grim machinery had been set in motion. The Privy Council, under the guidance of Cranmer and Thomas Audley, Lord Chancellor, began collecting testimony. And they knew where to begin: her household, her past, her companions. Francis Derham was among the first to be arrested. He was interrogated harshly as officials sought to determine the true nature of his relationship with the Queen. Did they share a bed? Had there been a promise of marriage? Was he still in contact with her after she became queen? Derham, perhaps sensing the peril he was in, insisted they had been lovers, but only before Catherine married the king. He framed their relationship as one of youthful indiscretion, not treachery. Yet in Tudor England, especially for a queen, past sin was more than personal. It was political. His confession led the investigators to deeper suspicions. If Catherine had been so intimately involved with Derham, could there be others? And then a more dangerous name emerged: Thomas Culpeper, a favorite of the king, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and, if rumors were true, a man who shared secret meetings with the Queen well after her marriage. It was Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who confirmed what many had only guessed. Yes, Catherine had met with Culpeper. Yes, she had sent him messages, arranged clandestine rendezvous, and relied on Jane as her go-between. This revelation changed everything. If Catherine had not only concealed her past but committed adultery as queen, it constituted high treason. And treason for a queen meant only one thing: death. The court, now fully aware of the scandal, recoiled. Those who had once sought her favor now distanced themselves as quickly as possible. Each witness questioned by the council understood that one wrong answer could cost them everything. Catherine, meanwhile, was interrogated in isolation. No longer the queen in velvet gowns, she was now a prisoner, frightened and frantic. Initial reports suggest she denied the charges. But as more confessions piled up, her position became unsustainable. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Catherine broke down. She admitted to her past with Derham, though not, at first, to any affair with Culpeper. She begged for mercy, but mercy was rarely granted to disgraced queens. The interrogations continued relentlessly. Derham and Culpeper were tortured, though sources differ on the extent, until their stories aligned with the council's suspicions. Culpeper eventually confessed to his meetings with the Queen, though he claimed they had not consummated their relationship. It mattered little. The intention alone, spoken or not, was enough to seal his fate. Both men were condemned. Meanwhile, Catherine's fate hung on a single question: had she betrayed the king during their marriage? To Henry, who had once called her his rose without a thorn, it no longer mattered. The betrayal was too deep, the humiliation too great. She had brought dishonor not only to herself, but to the crown and to the king's vision of perfect love. The web had closed around her. There were no more secrets left to hide. Only sentences to pronounce. Only blood yet to fall. Part 7. Fall from Grace, the Queen's imprisonment. The corridors that once echoed with the rustle of Catherine Howard's silks now rang with silence. The young queen, once radiant with promise, had become a ghost in her own court. Stripped of her attendants, her jewelry, and her dignity, she was no longer Catherine the Queen. She was simply the king's unchaste wife. And her fall, like so many in Tudor history, was swift, brutal, and absolute. Following the explosive revelations of her past and the damning accusations of adultery with Thomas Culpeper, Catherine was placed under formal arrest. Unlike in Boleyn, whose imprisonment began in the Tower, Catherine was initially confined to her apartments in Hampton Court. But this was not a kindness, it was a strategy. The king, broken and humiliated by what he viewed as the ultimate betrayal, refused to see her again. Catherine is said to have run through the halls of Hampton Court upon hearing of her arrest, pleading to speak with Henry. But the doors remained shut, and her cries went unanswered. Her household was dissolved. The ladies who once dressed her and whispered courtly gossip were interrogated, dismissed, or imprisoned. The elaborate world she had built around her collapsed like a house of cards. Soon, she was moved to Sion Abbey, an isolated place that offered no comfort, only cold introspection. There she was kept under constant surveillance, denied letters, and watched closely for signs of further deceit. She had gone from royal bride to royal prisoner in less than 18 months. At Sion, Catherine was interrogated repeatedly. The pressure upon her was enormous. Though she admitted her previous involvement with Francis Derham, she continued to deny that anything physical occurred between her and Culpeper. Lady Rochford's testimony, however, painted a damning picture of late-night meetings and coded messages. The Privy Council did not need confirmation of consummation. Intent was enough, and the court was ready to deliver its judgment. Catherine's psychological state began to unravel. Accustomed to adoration and comfort, she was now surrounded by hostility and silence. She was young, perhaps not even 20, and utterly unprepared for the machinery of Tudor justice. Letters from a time suggest she became deeply fearful, panicked, and even delusional. Some whispered that she hoped the king might forgive her, take pity on her youth, and bring her back. But Henry was unmoved. The man who had once called her his jewel now considered her a stain upon his honor. Her family, the powerful Howards, fared no better. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, disavowed her to save himself. Other members of the household were arrested, questioned, and shamed. Even those who had no knowledge of her past were caught in the dragnet. The court that had once supported her now scorned her. Survival in Tudor politics depended on swift disassociation from the fallen. As Catherine lingered in confinement, the executions of Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were carried out with ruthless precision. Derham was subjected to the full horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Culpeper, despite his previous favor with the king, was granted a merciful beheading. Their deaths sealed Catherine's fate. If the king was willing to destroy those closest to her, then no appeal, no plea, no tears could alter what was to come. Her final move came in February 1542. Parliament passed a bill of attainder against her, an act that condemned her without trial. She was legally declared guilty of treason, and the sentence was clear: death. On the night before her execution, Catherine was moved to the Tower of London. The same cold stones that had seen the rise of queens now prepared to swallow another. And as she walked past Traitor's Gate, perhaps she thought of Anne Boleyn, the cousin whose fate she now shared. The circle of Tudor tragedy had completed another turn. She was no longer queen, no longer wife, only a girl broken by power, politics, and her own past. Part 8. The Scaffold, Catherine's Final Moments. The morning of February 13th, 1542, was bitterly cold. Frost clung to the cobblestones of the Tower of London, and a gray mist curled around the ancient walls like a mourning shroud. Inside the Queen's lodging in the Tower, Catherine Howard prepared to face her final hour. She was no longer dressed in silk or pearls. Instead, she wore a plain, dark gown, a symbol of her humility, her penance, and her surrender. Her youth, once her greatest charm, now seemed only to emphasize the tragedy of her end. She had spent the night before her execution in prayer and contemplation. According to chroniclers, she requested a block be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head upon it. That haunting image, a teenage girl rehearsing her own death, has echoed through centuries as a symbol of innocence lost and justice coldly administered. Whatever her faults, Catherine faced her death with composure and dignity. She asked for nothing but God's mercy and forgiveness. And in a gesture that shocked even her jailers, she spoke not in fear, but with calm resolution. At the scaffold on Tower Green, the same site where Anne Boleyn had met her fate 6 years earlier, a small crowd gathered. It was not the bustling execution of a traitorous lord or condemned nobleman. It was quiet, somber, and filled with the kind of heavy silence that falls when people know they are witnessing something profoundly unjust. Catherine was led out by Sir John Gage, constable of the Tower, and accompanied by a few attending ladies. She walked steadily, her face pale but composed. Those present could not help but notice how small she appeared, not just in stature, but in age, in life experience, in the cruel weight of fate she carried. Upon reaching the scaffold, Catherine turned to the crowd. She did not speak at length, as Anne Boleyn had once done. Her words were brief and unrecorded in full, but all accounts agree on one chilling line she is said to have uttered: "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." Whether apocryphal or genuine, the sentiment captures the essence of Catherine's tragedy, a heart that yearned for love, caught in a world ruled by power and politics. She knelt at the block, placing her neck where she had practiced just hours before. The executioner, experienced and swift, did not delay. With a single stroke of the axe, Catherine Howard, Queen of England, cousin to Anne Boleyn, daughter of the Howard line, was no more. Her body was buried nearby, in an unmarked grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. There, alongside Anne Boleyn, Jane Grey, and others who fell to Tudor steel, she found her final rest. The king was not present. He had fled from the court days before, hiding from the memory of the girl he had once adored. To Henry, Catherine's death was not simply punishment, it was a necessary erasure of a chapter too painful to endure. But for many at court, her execution left an indelible stain. She had been young, manipulated, perhaps foolish, but hardly malicious. Her death was a political necessity, not a moral triumph. In the weeks that followed, a strange hush fell over court life. There were no celebrations, no declarations of justice served. Only the quiet turning of time and the slow forgetting of a girl who had once lit up Henry's world with laughter and youth. But history would not forget. Catherine's death, like that of Anne Boleyn, would come to symbolize the brutal consequences of love and ambition in the Tudor age. She became a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the memory of a king who had loved too rashly and ruled too absolutely. Her story had ended, but her legacy, tragic, complex, and deeply human, had only just begun. Part 9. The Aftermath, a court in mourning, a king in ruin. Catherine Howard's execution cast a long and somber shadow across the English court. Though officially framed as a just punishment for treason, few could deny the weight of sorrow and unease that followed her death. The vibrant girl who had once danced through the halls of Hampton Court was gone, silenced not only by the axe, but by kingdom too bound to fear and formality to question her fate. And in her absence, the glitter of court life dimmed. The courtiers who had once jostled for her attention now whispered in corners, their laughter subdued and their ambitions curbed. Lady Rochford, who had facilitated Catherine's secret meetings, had lost her sanity in the Tower and was executed alongside her. The image of two women, cousins by marriage, led to the scaffold together, both betrayed and broken by love, haunted the minds of many. A chill settled over the court not merely from winter's breath, but from the deep realization that in Henry's England, no one was safe. Not queens, not ladies, not even family. And what of the king? Henry VIII, who had once gloried in pageantry and the vigor of young wives, now withdrew into himself. He did not publicly mourn Catherine. He did not utter her name in sorrow or remembrance. But his silence spoke volumes. Some reports suggest he fell into a deep depression. He became irritable, distant, plagued by illness and age. His leg wound, an ulcer that never fully healed, grew worse, and with it his temper darkened. He was no longer the athletic prince of his youth, but a bloated, aging monarch haunted by failure and death. 5 wives had come and gone, 2 had been beheaded. And still, no queen had delivered the kind of peace or permanence he craved. Catherine's execution marked a turning point not just in his reign, but in his character. Where once he had been impulsive, now he became suspicious. Where once he had been hopeful, now he was weary. He began to trust fewer men, rely more on fear than favor. The king who had once dreamed of romantic union now ruled with grim calculation. The Howard family, one of the most powerful in England, was devastated by the scandal. Though the Duke of Norfolk distanced himself from his niece to protect his own skin, the stain on the family name lingered. Several Howards were arrested, fined, or removed from courtly influence. The court's appetite for their prestige had soured, replaced by quiet disdain and caution. For years to come, the very name, Howard, would evoke not honor, but humiliation. But the sorrow of Catherine's death stretched beyond political circles. Among the people, especially women, there grew a subtle murmur of sympathy. Some saw in her a victim, a young girl used for advancement, punished for desire, and destroyed by forces she barely understood. Ballads and tales began to circulate quietly, speaking of her beauty, her fate, and the ghostly echo of her steps in the corridors of Hampton Court. Legends whispered that her spirit wandered the palace at night, screaming for mercy, reliving the moment she learned her fate. Whether true or not, these stories reflected a collective conscience struggling to reconcile justice with cruelty. And so the court moved on, mechanically, reluctantly, and with a deep sense of loss. New alliances would form, new queens would rise, But something had shifted. Catherine Howard had reminded the Tudor world that beneath the jewels and titles, queens were human, capable of love, fear, and mistakes. Her death had not only altered Henry, it had cracked the illusion of safety for everyone else. The laughter at court would return, but it would never be quite as free. The music would play again, but it would never be quite as bright. For in the heart of England's most magnificent court, the memory of a girl undone by love and punished by power would linger, quiet, tragic, and unforgettable. Part 10. The Ghost in the Gallery, Catherine's Haunting Legacy. As the decades passed, Catherine Howard's name did not vanish into the long scroll of Tudor queens. Instead, it clung to the stone walls at Hampton Court, whispered through generations, remembered not as a footnote, but as a phantom. For while history recorded her as Henry VIII's fifth wife, young, reckless, and executed, folklore turned her into something more enduring. A spirit, a warning, a presence that refused to be erased. The legend of Catherine Howard's ghost took root early. Those who walked the corridors of Hampton Court after her death reported strange occurrences. Some claimed to hear footsteps in the long gallery, the kind that rushed, frantic and panicked, as if echoing her desperate attempt to reach the king and plead for her life. Others saw fleeting glimpses of a pale figure in white, hands outstretched, mouth open in a silent cry. She became known as the Screaming Lady, and her ghost reportedly haunts the haunted gallery to this day. It is said she could be seen running toward the door of the Chapel Royal, where she begged to speak to Henry, before vanishing into thin air. But beyond the chill of ghost stories, Catherine's legacy lived on in more thoughtful ways. Writers, historians, and poets began to re-examine her fate, not through the lens of scandal, but through compassion. She was not merely a flirt or a foolish girl. She was a teenager, placed in a royal marriage to a man 3 decades older, burdened by a past that had never been forgiven. And she had been given little guidance, surrounded by a court that prioritized political gain over emotional truth. In the centuries that followed, the world changed, and so did the lens through which Catherine was viewed. Victorian writers romanticize her, painting her as a tragic heroine, beautiful, naive, destroyed by love and cruelty. Later scholars challenged this narrative, suggesting she was more than just a passive victim. Some argued that Catherine showed agency, navigating court politics with her own desires and making choices, albeit dangerous ones, in pursuit of autonomy. This dual image of helplessness and defiance continues to define her place in history. Her ghost, too, evolved. In literature, she became a symbol of womanhood crushed under the weight of male power. In theater and film, she was portrayed as youthful and doomed, echoing modern anxieties about control, freedom, and consequence. Each generation reinterpreted Catherine through its own fears and values. And always the gallery remained silent, sacred, shadowed, a space where the past was never truly gone. Even among the other wives of Henry VIII, Catherine's story holds unique resonance. Anne Boleyn was ambitious, educated, and politically sharp. Jane Seymour was pious and compliant. Anna Cleves outlived them all through clever diplomacy. But Catherine, for all her faults and impulsiveness, left behind something different, a raw, emotional truth. She reminded the world that queens were often girls first, girls with dreams, secrets, and vulnerabilities. And that, in a court where love was dangerous, sincerity could be fatal. Today, Hampton Court draws visitors from across the globe. Many come for its architecture, its gardens, its rich Tudor heritage. But others come for her, for the echo of her feet in the haunted gallery, for the story of a girl who dared to seek affection in a world that punished desire, and for the chilling reminder that the past is never truly buried. It walks beside us, whispering softly through stone and shadow. In Catherine Howard, we see not just a queen lost to history. We see a mirror of youth crushed by power, of passion destroyed by duty, of humanity silenced by judgment. Her ghost remains, not merely in legend, but in us. In every story retold, in every tear imagined, in every question asked about what justice truly means. Part 11. In the Eyes of History, Catherine reimagined by scholars. Catherine Howard's legacy, once marred by scandal and tragedy, has increasingly become the subject of scholarly reassessment. Over the centuries, history has favored certain interpretations of the past, often influenced by the prevailing values of the time. But as historians turned their attention to the complexities of Catherine's life, they began to challenge the simplistic narrative of her as merely a naive, headstrong girl doomed by her own mistakes. Instead, they sought to understand her within the context of the court she inhabited, a court ruled by a king whose whims were as merciless as his power was absolute. At the heart of this reevaluation was a new understanding of Catherine's circumstances. She had been thrust into a world of treachery and politics at a young age, far removed from the innocence often associated with youth in more peaceful times. Her marriage to Henry VIII was not a fairy tale, but a political necessity on both sides, binding her not only to the king, but to a dangerous, unstable court where survival was an art in itself. Catherine's own background, marked by the downfall of her family and the shadow of her cousin and Boleyn's execution, meant she never had the luxury of personal freedom. Historians began to explore the complex interplay of family, power, and survival in Catherine's life. Though she had few political ambitions compared to her predecessors, her youth and beauty made her a pawn in the royal game of marriage and politics. By the time she was married to Henry, Catherine was a fragile girl in a position of immense pressure. She had to balance the love and affection of a king whose passion often turned to possessiveness with the fear of being discarded or worse, as in Boleyn had been before her. Moreover, Catherine's relationship with Thomas Culpeper has long been a point of intrigue for scholars. Some historians argue that her infatuation with Culpeper was not just a youthful indiscretion, but an attempt to find genuine affection in a loveless marriage. Henry, increasingly consumed by his own deteriorating health and his desire for a queen who could give him the son he so desperately craved, was distant and indifferent. Catherine, still a teenager, may have sought the warmth and attention from Culpeper that she lacked in her marriage. The idea of a woman who can not only fall in love but risk everything for that love provides a more nuanced view of Catherine than the one-dimensional, foolish girl commonly portrayed. Furthermore, the role of the men who shaped Catherine's fate is now being more closely examined. Her step-grandfather, the Duke of Norfolk, had been a major player in the marriage arrangement, pushing for Catherine's rise in court to further his own family's power. But when Catherine's infidelity came to light, Norfolk, rather than protecting her, allowed her to be condemned to death, seemingly with little remorse. Such political maneuvering was commonplace in the Tudor court, where loyalty was often a currency exchanged for favors and survival. In recent years, Catherine Howard has been framed as a tragic figure who was a product of her time. Rather than merely an innocent girl seduced by her own desires, scholars are beginning to see her as a victim of circumstance. Her story is one of manipulation, betrayal, and a harsh societal expectation that women conform to an impossible ideal of purity and loyalty. It is a tragedy not just of Catherine's own making, but of a system that demanded perfection from those who were anything but perfect. As feminist historians have pointed out, Catherine's life reflects a broader pattern in which women's actions were often misjudged or punished with an unequal severity. In a time when a woman's reputation was everything, and a queen's behavior scrutinized to the utmost, Catherine's fall is a stark example of the gendered realities of power. Her life and death serve as a poignant reminder of how history has often been shaped by the voices of the powerful, leaving the voices of the vulnerable to fade into silence. But as the lens through which we view history shifts, Catherine's story is increasingly reclaimed by those who seek to uncover the voices of the oppressed, the forgotten, and the misunderstood. In this reimagined version of her life, Catherine Howard is no longer just a tragic queen to be remembered for her youthful mistakes. She is a symbol of the untold stories of women who navigated treacherous paths, often at the mercy of others, in the pursuit of love, agency, and survival. As scholars and writers continue to explore her life, Catherine's legacy is gradually being rewritten. No longer solely defined by her death or the mistakes of her youth, she is becoming a more complex, multidimensional figure. One who, in the face of unimaginable pressure and a brutal system, sought to live as fully as she could, even if it meant defying the very expectations that sought to control her. Part 12. Catherine's influence on modern understanding of the Tudor queens. The story of Catherine Howard, once relegated to the shadows of royal history, has come to play a pivotal role in the way modern audiences perceive the Tudor queens. Her tragic fate, paired with the evolving interpretation of her life, has shifted the conversation around the nature of power, gender, and loyalty within the Tudor court. Where once Catherine was simply viewed as another of Henry VIII's ill-fated wives, today her story has sparked new questions about the roles women played in a world dominated by men and political intrigue. In the past, history often overlooked the personal lives of queens and focused solely on their political roles or dynastic significance. But as scholars and writers dig deeper into the complexities of Catherine's life, her story becomes an important thread in the broader narrative of the Tudor women. Her short-lived marriage to Henry VIII has become an entry point for exploring the hidden struggles that queens faced as they balanced their personal desires with their political duties. Catherine's vulnerability, youth, and emotional complexity offer an invaluable counterpoint to the more famous, more studied queens of the period, like Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I. One of the most significant contributions Catherine's story has made to modern historical understanding is the spotlight it casts on the precariousness of a queen's position. As modern historians examine her life, they realize that the role of queen consort was far more precarious than it might seem from the outside. A woman could rise to the height of royal favor, only to fall from grace in the blink of an eye. For Catherine, the very qualities that made her a desirable wife for Henry, her beauty, charm, and youth, also worked against her in court where the king's affections were fleeting and easily turned to disdain. This instability, which was often lethal for women, becomes more evident when examining Catherine's relationship with Henry in the context of her own desires for love and security. Furthermore, Catherine's position in the court shines a light on the often invisible labor of women in royal families. Beyond the public spectacle, the queen was expected to maintain her household, manage relationships with courtiers, provide heirs, and preserve the family's legacy. These were monumental tasks, and yet they were often overshadowed by the personal and political dynamics that unfolded in the royal bedchamber and beyond. Catherine's downfall exposes the vulnerabilities that came with such power, revealing that even the highest-ranking women could be reduced to mere political pawns, subject to the whims of those who held power. Scholars have also explored Catherine's legacy in terms of how it has been remembered and reinterpreted over time. In the centuries following her death, Catherine was often portrayed as a cautionary tale, a victim of her own youthful indiscretions, and a lesson in the dangers of youthful passion. But in more recent decades, Catherine has been embraced as a tragic figure whose life and death underscore the complexities of womanhood in a time when a woman's survival depended not only on her beauty, but on her ability to navigate a world of ruthless ambition, betrayal, and shifting alliances. Her story has become an emblem of how historical narratives can evolve, reflecting changing attitudes toward gender, power, and agency. Her influence also extends beyond the realm of historical scholarship into the world of popular culture. In novels, films, and television shows, Catherine Howard's character has been reimagined as a woman trapped in a gilded cage, seeking love and freedom, but ultimately undone by her own desires. Perhaps most famously, in the television series The Tudors, Catherine is portrayed as a passionate, impulsive young woman who seeks affection outside her marriage, thus setting the stage for her downfall. While some critics have taken issue with the liberties taken in such adaptations, they have nonetheless sparked important conversations about Catherine's motivations and the challenges she faced as a young woman in a dangerously high-stakes environment. Catherine's story also plays a crucial role in the ongoing conversation about the treatment of women in history. Her downfall, caused by both her personal actions and the systemic forces that shaped her life, opens up a broader dialogue about how women in history have been judged more harshly than their male counterparts. Catherine's execution, her death at the hands of the same system that had once celebrated her youth and beauty, echoes the punishment faced by many women throughout history who defied societal expectations or simply found themselves caught in the web of a patriarchal system. In modern times, Catherine's legacy serves as a reminder that history often forgets or misrepresents the complexities of women's lives, reducing them to simple archetypes of virtue or villainy. As we continue to revisit and reassess the lives of women like Catherine Howard, we come closer to understanding the broader struggles of women in power, how they were both shaped and limited by the world around them. By embracing the full scope of Catherine's life, the triumphs, the failings, the desires, and the regrets, modern historians have helped restore a voice to a woman who had once been silenced. Through her, we are reminded that even those who seem the most powerless in history may have been driven by forces larger than themselves, and that understanding their stories requires empathy, nuance, and a willingness to ask difficult questions about the structures of power. Part 13. The Enduring Mystique of Catherine Howard. The story of Catherine Howard endures not only because of her tragic fate, but because of the mystique that surrounds her life. Her name, often spoken in the same breath as scandal and betrayal, continues to captivate those who seek to understand the forgotten queens of history. What makes Catherine's story so enduring is not simply her fall from grace, but the myriad layers of mystery that shroud her life. Despite the centuries that have passed since her death, her character remains an enigma, one that refuses to be fully unraveled. Her beauty, youth, and charm have long been noted as reasons for her initial rise to power, but it is her personality and motivations that continue to spark debate. Was she merely an innocent girl, overwhelmed by the pressures of the court? Or was she a shrewd player in the dangerous game of Tudor politics, acting on her desires and ambitions, even at the cost of her life? The ambiguity surrounding Catherine's true nature is part of what makes her so fascinating to both scholars and the public alike. In the world of royal marriages, Catherine was an anomaly, a young woman who was thrust into a marriage with a king much older than herself, and yet her role was far more complex than the traditional expectations of a queen consort. Her position, defined by political necessity, should have been one of stability and subservience, yet Catherine seemed to resist this role in subtle ways. Her flirtations, her passion, and her relationships outside her marriage to Henry VIII have led some historians to view her as a victim of circumstance, while others see her as a young woman trying to assert control over her own life. This tension between victimhood and agency is what keeps Catherine's story so compelling. In many ways, Catherine's life reflects the tension between individual desires and the larger forces of history. She was caught in a world where her personal emotions, her love life, and even her youth were commodities to be used or discarded by those with more power. Her affair with Thomas Culpeper, one of the most famous scandals in Tudor history, was seen by some as a desperate attempt to find affection in a marriage that lacked warmth. Yet, her affair also illustrates the limitations placed on her agency, how her ability to act in her own interests was severely restricted by the weight of her royal title and her husband's volatile temper. The questions that arise from Catherine's life are not easily answered. Was she simply a victim of Henry's obsession with power, or did she play a role in her own downfall? Could her fate have been different if she had acted differently, or was she doomed from the start, caught in a system that offered little room for personal choice? These questions remain unanswered, feeding the allure and mystery of her life. Catherine's tragic death at the young age of 19 has cemented her place as one of the most poignant figures in Tudor history. Her execution, ordered by the very man she had once loved, highlights the devastating consequences of living in a time when personal ambition, lust, and betrayal were met with ruthless justice. Her demise is a symbol of the dangerous world in which she lived, one where a young queen's life could be taken away in an instant and her legacy twisted into something dark and tragic. Yet as much as Catherine's death is remembered, her life continues to captivate because of the questions it raises about the nature of power, love, and survival. Unlike some of the other queens of the Tudor dynasty, whose lives are defined by clear political actions or personal triumphs, Catherine's story is one of contradictions and complexities. Her beauty and youth, her ambition and innocence, her love and her betrayals, these elements create a story that is not easily categorized. And this is what gives Catherine Howard the mystique she holds today. In the centuries following her death, writers, poets, and artists have returned to Catherine's story again and again. They have sought to reimagine her in ways that reflect not only the historical facts but the emotions and motivations that shaped her actions. Through this process, Catherine's image has morphed from that of a naive girl destroyed by her own impulsiveness to a figure of tragic complexity, one whose life offers profound insights into the challenges faced by women in positions of power, vulnerability, and constraint. And it is through this lens that Catherine's mystique endures, inviting each generation to ponder who she truly was and what her life says about the intersection of love, power, and fate. Though history has largely forgotten her true voice, the ongoing rediscovery of her story continues to shape the way we understand the women of the Tudor court. Through the lens of Catherine Howard, we are reminded that queens, like all women, were individuals with desires, dreams, and fears, trapped in a world where their fates were often sealed by forces beyond their control. Catherine's legacy, therefore, is not just one of tragedy and death, but of resurrection and reimagining. Her story is far from finished, for as long as her name is spoken, as long as her tale is retold, she will remain not just a ghost of the past, but a living presence, demanding to be understood, remembered, and interpreted in new ways. Part 14. Catherine Howard's Influence on Tudor Women's Representation. The tragic life of Catherine Howard has left an indelible mark not only on Tudor history, but on the way we understand the role of women in historical narratives. Her rise to the throne and subsequent fall from grace offer a stark reflection of the ways in which Tudor women were represented, and more often than not, misrepresented throughout history. Though she was a queen, Catherine's life was shaped by the constraints placed on her because of her gender, youth, and beauty. Her story has become a symbol for the way in which women in power, particularly in royal courts, were often reduced to mere objects of desire or political tools, stripped of their complexity and humanity. As historians and scholars have re-examined Catherine's life, her influence has extended into modern conversations about the portrayal of women in history. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Catherine Howard has not been subjected to the same glorification or vilification as other Tudor queens, like Anne Boleyn or Elizabeth I. Instead, her representation has evolved into a more nuanced understanding of the pressures faced by women of her position, pressures that were uniquely shaped by both personal desires and public expectations. In many ways, Catherine's story has served as a springboard for exploring the broader narrative of women's agency in a male-dominated world, offering a glimpse into the complexities of royal life from a female perspective. The cultural shift in how we view Catherine is part of a larger movement in historical scholarship where the narratives of women, once overshadowed or ignored, are being brought to the forefront. Catherine's tragic story, characterized by youthful passion, misjudgment, and a lack of agency, challenges the traditional portrayal of women in history as either perfect paragons of virtue or villains driven by malice. Her life exposes the fragile line between virtue and scandal, and how women in the Tudor court were expected to walk that line carefully or face dire consequences. As Catherine's influence on historical scholarship grows, her story is also being reinterpreted in popular culture, where she is now often portrayed as a more sympathetic character. Television dramas, novels, and plays have painted Catherine as a vulnerable young woman trapped by her beauty, ambition, and the machinations of others. This portrayal has resonated with audiences who see Catherine not just as a tragic figure, but as a representative of the struggles that many women face when attempting to balance personal desire with societal expectations. Moreover, Catherine's story has helped to underscore the importance of agency in the lives of women, even in seemingly powerless positions. Her actions, however misguided or desperate, are a reflection of her attempt to carve out space for herself in a court that offered little room for personal freedom. In her affair with Thomas Culpeper, Catherine was seeking not just affection, but a sense of control over her own life, something that was denied her within the confines of her marriage to Henry VIII. Her pursuit of love, though ultimately destructive, reflects the deeply human desire for connection and emotional fulfillment, which resonates with women across history and in contemporary society. The modern fascination with Catherine's story has led to a re-evaluation of how women's roles were depicted in the Tudor court, where they were often subject to the whims of men, whether kings, fathers, or powerful uncles. Catherine's legacy highlights the contradictions inherent in the way Tudor women were portrayed. They were either sainted for their piety or vilified for their perceived sexual transgressions, with little room for the complicated truths that lay in between. In examining Catherine's life, we see a shift from this binary view of women in history, as scholars now seek to uncover the multifaceted nature of women's experiences during the Tudor period. In this way, Catherine's influence has contributed significantly to the representation of Tudor women in historical discourse. Her life serves as a reminder that women in history, particularly those in positions of power or royalty, were not mere symbols of virtue or vice, but individuals with complex inner lives shaped by their circumstances. By reconsidering her story, we are also able to better understand the broader impact of gender on power, politics, and survival in the Tudor era. Catherine's tragic fate, coupled with the new ways in which her life is understood, has opened the door for a more inclusive and empathetic interpretation of the lives of all Tudor women. Her legacy is one of transformation, not just in how we view her, but in how we approach the histories of the women who lived under the shadow of the Tudor dynasty. Catherine's story has helped to highlight the struggles faced by women who are not only defined by their marriages, but by their ability to navigate a perilous world that offered few options for personal agency. The lessons learned from her life have paved the way for more nuanced portrayals of the queens, mistresses, and noble women of Tudor England, whose voices have often been obscured by the larger political narrative. In the end, Catherine Howard's influence on the representation of Tudor women cannot be overstated. She has become a lens through which we can view the complexities of gender, power, and love in one of the most dramatic periods of English history. Her legacy will continue to inspire as her story shifts from that of a mere cautionary tale to one of deeper understanding and reflection on the roles women played and continue to play in the shaping of history. Part 15. Catherine Howard's Legacy in Modern Feminist Thought. Catherine Howard's tragic life, once seen through the narrow lens of a young woman's misfortune, has evolved into a symbol of the complexities surrounding gender, power, and survival in a patriarchal society. Her story now resonates deeply within modern feminist thought, offering a poignant example of how historical women navigated and were constrained by the rigid structures of their time. Catherine's legacy has become a subject of critical reflection on the ways in which women's roles have been historically defined, manipulated, and often erased, leaving behind only traces of their struggles. At the heart of feminist interpretations of Catherine Howard is the notion of agency, or rather the lack thereof. For much of her life, Catherine was not seen as a subject with her own will, but rather as an object for political maneuvering and a vehicle for dynastic purposes. Her marriage to Henry VIII, which could have been viewed as a strategic alliance for her own power, was ultimately shaped by the whims of men, both her husband and the male advisors who controlled her fate. Her youthful desires, especially in her relationship with Thomas Culpeper, have been both criticized and understood within the framework of a woman's desperate attempt to find personal agency in a world that offered her little autonomy. Catherine's position at court, where she was seen not as a sovereign queen, but as a young, beautiful, and vulnerable object, reflects the broader social dynamics that feminists have long critiqued. Her life underscores the ways in which women were often defined by their physical appearance, youth, and ability to please the men in power, rather than being viewed as fully realized individuals with their own desires, goals, and aspirations. Her downfall, though a result of her actions, was also a direct consequence of her gendered status in a patriarchal system that punished women for their sexual agency and condemned them when they failed to conform to its rigid expectations. Feminist scholars have often pointed to Catherine as a tragic embodiment of the ways in which women in history have been judged by different standards than men. While men of the time, including Henry VIII himself, were allowed the freedom to engage in extramarital affairs and multiple marriages without facing the same kind of moral scrutiny, Catherine's youthful indiscretions became the basis for her condemnation. In this sense, Catherine's story has become a powerful example of how history has often been written by and for men, leaving women like Catherine to be judged harshly by societal standards that didn't afford them the same freedoms. Furthermore, Catherine's fate has inspired feminist discussions about the silencing of women in history. Her life has been so often reduced to a cautionary tale of a naive girl who courted disaster, with little regard for the socio-political pressures she faced. The narrative of her life has often been dominated by her scandal and death, but feminist historians have sought to reframe her story, looking beyond the tragedy to explore her humanity, desires, and the difficult choices she faced. In doing so, they ask us to consider what it means for women to have their stories told, and how often those stories are shaped by the male-dominated systems that have long controlled the writing of history. One of the key elements of Catherine's story within feminist discourse is the questioning of her supposed innocence and guilt. She has often been portrayed as a simple victim, a girl swept away by her own passions and the overpowering desires of the men around her. However, modern feminist thought challenges this reductionist view, urging us to see Catherine as a woman with desires, autonomy, and agency, even if those traits were limited and ultimately led to her downfall. Catherine's relationship with Culpeper is often viewed as a desperate attempt to find the emotional connection that she could not find with Henry, and feminist interpretations consider the depth of her need for affection and love in a world that was otherwise indifferent to her personal happiness. Catherine's story also invites reflection on the broader question of how women's desires have been treated in historical narratives. Feminist scholars argue that the way Catherine was punished for her sexuality, and by extension, the way women's sexuality has often been punished throughout history, reveals deep-seated gender biases that persist in many cultures today. Her punishment was severe, not only because of her infidelity, but because of the way her actions defied the role that women were expected to play in royal society. This has led to feminist critiques of how women's emotional and sexual lives have historically been scrutinized, moralized, and ultimately judged in ways that men's lives were not. Today, Catherine's story serves as a catalyst for broader conversations about women's autonomy, sexual agency, and the double standards that continue to shape the lives of women worldwide. Her life reminds us that even in the modern era, women are still often judged by different standards when it comes to their behavior, desires, and relationships. Catherine's fate highlights how women's roles in history are often reduced to simplistic narratives of virtue or vice, with little room for the complexities of their lived experiences. In feminist thought, Catherine's legacy also underscores the need to continue breaking down the historical silences around women's lives. Her life and death offer a poignant example of the erasure of women's voices and stories, and the need to uncover the histories of women who were silenced by the patriarchy. Feminist scholars, artists, and writers continue to reimagine Catherine, seeking to restore her dignity and agency by offering new interpretations of her life that reflect her humanity, struggles, and resilience. By reclaiming her story, they are not only challenging historical narratives, but also helping to create space for women's stories to be told with nuance, complexity, and empathy. Part 16: The Aftermath of Catherine Howard's Death, Political and Cultural Repercussions. The death of Catherine Howard was not merely a personal tragedy. It marked a significant moment in the history of the Tudor court, leaving both political and cultural ripples that would be felt for years to come. Her execution, ordered by her husband, Henry VIII, sent shockwaves throughout England, and the aftermath of her death altered the delicate political landscape of the time. As the fifth queen to be executed during Henry's reign, Catherine's fate was a stark reminder of the precariousness of royal power and the ease with which a king could dispose of those he once cherished. The immediate political repercussions of Catherine's death were profound. For Henry VIII, her execution was another dark chapter in a reign that had become increasingly defined by marital turmoil and ruthlessness. By executing Catherine, Henry not only rid himself of a wife who had betrayed him, but also sent a clear message to the court about the consequences of disloyalty, especially to a king whose authority was absolute. This event solidified Henry's reputation as a monarch willing to take extreme measures to maintain control over both his kingdom and his personal relationships. In some ways, Catherine's death acted as a cautionary tale for future queens and women at court, emphasizing the precariousness of their position under Henry's rule. For the court itself, Catherine's execution served as both a sobering reminder of the dangers of royal favor and a marker of how quickly fortunes could change in the volatile world of Tudor politics. It is important to note that although Catherine was initially favored for her youth and beauty, her downfall exposed the fragility of a woman's power in a court governed by the whims of a tyrannical king. The political landscape at court shifted once more, with those who had once been close to Catherine now forced to navigate the new dynamics created by her death. Advisors and officials who had been loyal to her were either dismissed, imprisoned, or forced to recant their support for the fallen queen. In this way, Catherine's death disrupted the delicate balance of power, further emphasizing the volatile nature of Henry's reign. Catherine's execution also had cultural repercussions that extended beyond the royal court and deepened the narrative of women as victims of both love and power. Her death contributed to the broader Tudor cultural climate, where the lives of queens were often viewed through the lens of tragedy and excess. Catherine's youthful beauty and untimely demise added to the growing myth of the tragic queen, a theme that was explored in literature, plays, and other forms of artistic expression during the Tudor period and beyond. Her story was woven into the larger tapestry of royal tragedy, which included the tales of Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour, women who had also suffered at the hands of a ruthless monarch. As time passed, the political and cultural significance of Catherine's death continued to evolve. In the years following her execution, her story became a subject of interest for historians, writers, and playwrights who sought to understand and interpret her tragic fate. The romanticization of her life and death began to take root in popular culture, where she was often portrayed as a young and innocent queen who was a pawn in the hands of ruthless men. Her story became emblematic of the dangers faced by women who dared to step out of line or challenge the expectations placed upon them by society and the royal court. In this way, Catherine's legacy was shaped not only by the political realities of her time, but also by the cultural narratives that were built around her figure. Over time, the tragic image of Catherine Howard began to be reimagined in works of art, literature, and theater, where her innocence and vulnerability were highlighted. Artists and writers sought to understand the emotional turmoil she must have faced in her final years, emphasizing her youth, her desires, and her unfortunate fall from grace. Her story, as portrayed in these artistic works, painted a picture of Catherine as a victim of both her circumstances and her own actions, adding layers of emotional depth to her character. In this sense, Catherine's execution was not just a political event, but a cultural turning point that marked the beginning of her transformation from historical figure to literary symbol. Historians, too, began to reassess the political context surrounding her death, recognizing that it was not just her personal mistakes that led to her downfall, but the larger political machinations of the Tudor court. The instability of Henry's later reign, marked by his own declining health and the increasingly erratic nature of his decisions, made Catherine's position even more vulnerable. Her execution became a symbol of the wider uncertainties faced by individuals at court during Henry's later years, when loyalty and betrayal were often indistinguishable. As such, Catherine's death became more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of infidelity. It became a reflection of the broader political climate in which Henry VIII's court operated. Ultimately, the aftermath of Catherine Howard's death shaped not only the political landscape of the Tudor court, but also the cultural memory of her life and legacy. Her tragic end deepened the complexity of how women were viewed in Tudor England, as both figures of power and subjects of male dominance. As a queen who was discarded and executed at a young age, Catherine's story became emblematic of the high price women paid for falling out of favor in the Tudor dynasty. Her death not only sealed her own fate, but also provided future generations with a lens through which to examine the intersection of gender, power, and the devastating consequences of love and betrayal. Part 17. Catherine Howard in Modern Historical Reinterpretations. In the centuries following Catherine Howard's death, her story remained one of intrigue, tragedy, and mystery, frequently appearing in historical works as a cautionary tale of youthful indiscretion and royal folly. However, in recent years, historians and scholars have begun to re-examine Catherine's life through new lenses, offering reinterpretations that challenge the conventional narratives of her as merely a victim or a naive girl consumed by desire. These modern interpretations not only seek to humanize Catherine, but also to understand the complexities of her life and the circumstances that led to her tragic end. Modern historical works have attempted to provide a more nuanced view of Catherine Howard, shifting away from the traditional narrative of her as an innocent and unaware pawn in the hands of men. One of the most significant reinterpretations focuses on Catherine's agency, exploring how she navigated the perilous world of Tudor politics, even within the confines of her limited power. Historians now contend that Catherine was not merely a victim of Henry VIII's cruelty, but a young woman struggling to find her place within a court that demanded conformity and obedience, where even the slightest misstep could lead to disaster. Catherine's relationships at court, particularly her connection with Thomas Culpeper, are also being reassessed through a modern lens. Rather than solely focusing on her betrayal of Henry VIII, some historians suggest that Catherine's actions were motivated by a deeper longing for affection and emotional connection, a longing that was largely ignored in the traditional accounts of her story. While her actions were certainly reckless, historians now acknowledge that her relationships were a reflection of the emotional and psychological strain she endured in a court that viewed women primarily as political tools rather than as individuals with their own desires and needs. Additionally, the role of Catherine's family has come into sharper focus in modern historical analyses. Her upbringing, often described as one of poverty and neglect, placed her in a vulnerable position, one where she had little guidance or support as she entered the treacherous world of the royal court. Her family's influence, or lack thereof, has been reevaluated, with scholars recognizing that her lack of a strong familial network may have contributed to her vulnerability in the face of political and personal pressures. Catherine's tragic end is thus seen not only as a result of her own decisions, but also as a reflection of the societal structures and familial dynamics that left her without adequate protection. The reinterpretation of Catherine Howard's story also highlights the broader gender dynamics of the Tudor court and the ways in which women's actions were policed, judged, and punished in ways that men's actions were not. While Henry VIII's numerous marriages and extramarital affairs were largely accepted or overlooked, Catherine's transgressions were met with swift and brutal punishment. Modern historians argue that Catherine's punishment was a reflection of the double standards that governed gender relations in Tudor England, where women were held to far stricter moral codes than their male counterparts. This understanding has led to a more empathetic reading of her life, one that recognizes her humanity and the external forces that shaped her decisions. In recent years, Catherine's story has also gained prominence in popular culture, with historical novels, television series, and films offering more diverse portrayals of her character. In many of these modern retellings, Catherine is portrayed not just as a tragic figure, but as a young woman grappling with complex emotions, societal pressures, and her own desires. This shift in representation has contributed to a more sympathetic view of Catherine, with many seeing her as a victim of circumstances rather than a mere object of historical scandal. Her story, once confined to the annals of royal tragedy, has become a focal point for discussions on gender, power, and the ways in which history has often silenced the voices of women. Television series such as The Tudors and novels like The Lady in the Tower by Alison Weir have presented Catherine as a more fully realized character, highlighting her emotional struggles, her vulnerability, and her efforts to navigate the dangerous waters of Tudor court politics. These portrayals have played a key role in reshaping public perception of Catherine, offering viewers and readers a more compassionate understanding of her plight. By focusing on her emotional life, these reinterpretations also underscore the complexity of her situation, portraying her as more than just a victim of Henry's whims, but as a young woman caught in a web of political and personal intrigue. Moreover, modern feminist scholars have used Catherine's story to highlight the systemic inequalities women faced in Tudor England, offering her as a symbol of the gendered pressures that shaped the lives of women in the past. Catherine's tragic fate serves as a reminder of the ways in which women's personal agency was often stifled by societal expectations, and how their actions were subject to moral and sexual scrutiny in ways that men's actions were not. In this light, Catherine's legacy has become part of a broader feminist discourse on historical women, with scholars using her life as a lens through which to understand the intersection of power, gender, and the vulnerability of women in patriarchal societies. While Catherine Howard's life was short and ended in tragic circumstances, the modern reinterpretations of her story ensure that her memory endures in a more nuanced and thoughtful way. Rather than being relegated to a footnote in the history of the Tudor dynasty, Catherine is now seen as a symbol of the complexity and tragedy of womanhood in an age where women were often seen as property to be controlled, manipulated, and discarded when they no longer served their purpose. Her story continues to inspire new generations of historians, feminists, and artists who seek to understand and elevate the voices of women whose histories have been overlooked or distorted over time. Part 18. Catherine Howard's Enduring Influence, a Historical and Cultural Reflection. As centuries passed since her execution, Catherine Howard's life and death continued to resonate in the historical and cultural consciousness of England and beyond. Her tragic story, once overshadowed by the grand narratives of royal power struggles and political machinations, has evolved into a profound symbol of the personal costs of ambition, love, and betrayal. Today, Catherine's legacy is not merely confined to the annals of Tudor history, but endures as part of the collective memory, inspiring conversations about the complexities of royal life, the fragility of women's positions in power, and the human emotions that shaped even the most dramatic historical events. Catherine Howard's story is particularly significant in the context of the larger historical themes that defined the Tudor dynasty. She represents both the fragility and the resilience of women in a society where their fates were often determined by the whims of powerful men. In many ways, Catherine's life and death encapsulate the precarious position of women in the Tudor court, where personal desires and ambitions clashed with rigid expectations of morality, obedience, and loyalty. Her tragic fall from grace, spurred by youthful indiscretions and an unforgiving king, serves as a reflection of the harshness of the time, when even the slightest lapse in judgment could lead to catastrophic consequences. In the context of feminist history, Catherine Howard has become a figure who symbolizes the vulnerability of women who dared to exert their agency in a world that demanded their silence and submission. Her story has been used to challenge the historical erasure of women's voices, shedding light on the lives of queens and other women who are often relegated to the background, their stories reduced to footnotes in the grander narratives of kings, wars, and dynastic struggles. Through modern reinterpretations, Catherine has been given a voice, one that not only tells of her mistakes, but also of her desires, fears, and aspirations, complicating the simplistic narrative of the innocent victim. Her cultural influence has been felt across various forms of media, from literature and drama to film and television. In these modern retellings, Catherine is not just a victim of Henry VIII's cruelty, but a complex character whose story reflects universal human themes of love, ambition, betrayal, and regret. These portrayals have enabled contemporary audiences to connect with her, seeing beyond her status as a historical figure to recognize the emotional and psychological depth that modern storytellers have given her. Her story, which once seemed tragic and isolated, has become part of a broader conversation about the intersection of gender, power, and the ways in which history often distorts or diminishes the lives of women. Artists, playwrights, and filmmakers continue to draw on Catherine's legacy, using her life as a starting point for exploring themes of power and vulnerability. Her character is frequently portrayed as both a victim and a survivor, caught in a world that offered little room for personal freedom. In these retellings, her youthful energy and beauty are juxtaposed with the psychological toll of living in a court where every action was scrutinized, where personal failure was met with swift retribution. Her relationship with Thomas Culpeper, for example, is often reimagined as more than just a moment of passion, but a desperate attempt by Catherine to find love and solace in a life that was otherwise defined by manipulation, betrayal, and fear. Catherine's legacy also continues to spark conversations about the ways in which we view and treat young women in positions of power, both historically and in contemporary society. Her story serves as a poignant reminder of the dangers of idealizing women who are placed in spotlight, only to later condemn them when they fall short of society's expectations. The scrutiny and judgment Catherine faced in her time mirror the ways in which women today are often held to impossible standards of behavior, judged more harshly than their male counterparts for the same actions. In this sense, Catherine's story remains relevant, not only as a historical lesson, but as a cultural reflection of the ongoing challenges women face in navigating a world that frequently punishes them for their humanity. As history continues to evolve, the memory of Catherine Howard is no longer confined to a cautionary tale of youthful naivety and royal misfortune. Instead, she stands as a symbol of the complexities of identity, power, and gender that transcend her era. Her life, though short and tragic, has left an indelible mark on the historical and cultural fabric of the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty defined by both its grandeur and its brutality. Through modern scholarship, literature, and media, Catherine's story has been reinterpreted, shedding new light on her as a young woman whose personal desires and struggles were as real and powerful as any political ambition or royal intrigue. In the end, Catherine Howard's life, though defined by tragedy, serves as a reminder of the ever-present tensions between personal agency and the forces that seek to control it. Her legacy endures not just as a historical figure, but as a lens through which we can better understand the complexities of power, gender, and identity in both the past and present. Her story continues to challenge us, urging us to consider the lives of women whose voices have been silenced, whose legacies have been obscured, and whose experiences remain, in many ways, timeless. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through Tudor history, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Catherine Howard's tale is only one of many voices waiting to be heard. Share this story and help us bring more hidden histories to light.